I want to start by saying that I am not a handler. I have never held a handler's license, never sat the Compact's behavioral interface certification, never completed so much as a half-day orientation seminar in non-standard fauna management. My qualifications, as they appear in the Compact Employment Registry, are as follows. Certificate of Galley Operations, Grade 2, Certified Food Safety Officer, Civilian Transport Class, 6 years aboard Compact survey vessels as assistant cook, 2 years as lead cook, and the last 3 aboard the Korath's Reach in the role of head galley steward, which is a title that sounds more distinguished than it is. It means I plan the menus, I order the stores, I run 2 assistants and a very old dishwashing unit that jams every time someone puts a bowl in at the wrong angle, and I ring the meal bell at 0700, 1200, and 1800 every day the ship is underway. That is the extent of my relevant credentials, as far as I am aware. I am telling you this because I understand there has been some confusion in the documentation about what my role was during the 6-month transit aboard the Reach, and specifically about the designation that Wildlife Provisions has now applied to the galley feeding schedule. I did not petition for that designation. I did not request any formal recognition. I want that on record at the outset, because Director Morvath's filing suggests otherwise, and Director Morvath is, with respect, incorrect. What I did was ring the bell. I will try to explain what I mean by that, and the board can determine whether it constitutes grounds for the kind of documentation that has apparently been accumulating in my file for the past several months. The Korath's Reach is a mid-tier compact frontier survey transport 312 meters from bow to cargo bay doors, crew complement of 41, plus rotating survey teams of between 6 and 15, depending on the contract. She does a circuit of the outer Corindal corridor, picking up survey data, sample caches, and occasionally personnel, and returning them to Waystation Helic for processing and onward transfer. It is not glamorous work. The survey teams are often tired and often irritable. The transit legs are long, and my job is essentially to ensure that 40 to 50 odd people are fed adequately 3 times a day for months at a stretch. I am good at it. I do not say that boastfully. I simply mean that I have done it long enough that the logistics are not something I have to think about very hard anymore. The meal goes out on time. The stores are managed. The complaints, when they arise, are addressed. It is a job that rewards consistency above everything else, and I am a consistent person. The Soravel arrived at Survey Site Keth Provisional 7 during the Reach's 3rd transit leg of that cycle, which is to say they did not so much arrive as were discovered by Survey Team Dask, which had been operating at the site for 11 weeks and had not, until that point, noted any non-standard fauna in the survey zone. What they actually found, as I understand it from the contact report that was filed, I have read the contact report because the board asked me to familiarize myself with it, and was a collapsed burrow system on the northern slope of the site, consistent with a denning structure for Soravel females during the late nursing period. The cubs were in the burrow. The female was not. The contact report notes evidence of a predator encounter in the surrounding area and suggests the female had not returned to the burrow in a period consistent with several days. 3 injured animals, 2 with lacerations consistent with debris impact from the burrow collapse, 1 with what the Wildlife Provisional Report described as significant hypoglycemic presentation, which is a clinical way of saying the smallest one was not in good shape. The contact report triggered a Compact Wildlife Provisions hold on the survey site and required the survey team to transport the animals to the nearest registered medical facility, which was Waystation Helic, the same place the Reach was bound. Survey Team DASK, as I also understand it, were quite firm that this was not what they had signed up for, and their team lead, a woman named Soravel Hask, filed 3 separate complaints about the delay to their survey data processing schedule. I understand these complaints were noted and then not actioned, which is the compact's way of saying that the cubs were coming with us regardless. They put them in the lower cargo hold, in Bay 7, which is a climate-regulated storage space usually occupied by sealed sample containers and occasionally by equipment being returned from survey sites under the standard return and refit program. It smells of cold metal and preservative sealant under normal circumstances. They cleared about 12 square meters for the animals, rigged a temporary barrier from cargo netting, and left a contact request with wildlife provisions at Helic marked urgent, which, as a classification, turned out to mean approximately the same thing as the complaints filed by Survey Team Lead Hask, noted, not actionable within the relevant transit window. The transport from Site Keth Provisional 7 to the Reach's next waypoint was 3 weeks. Wildlife Provisions informed us at the commencement of transit that no handler would be available for transfer at that waypoint, and that we should continue to Helic, which was an additional 9 weeks out. Total, 12 weeks of transit with 3 injured Soravel cubs in Bay 7, and no one aboard with any relevant qualification whatsoever. Captain Arentov held a crew briefing that I remember with some clarity. She explained the situation. She explained the wildlife provisions requirement that the animals be kept alive and in reasonable health. She explained that she was a survey transport captain with 40 years of experience and had never been required to manage non-standard fauna at any point in those 40 years, and that she intended to maintain this record by delegating the responsibility to the person with the most transferable skills. She looked at me when she said, transferable skills. I looked at the table. The rest of the crew also looked at me, which I noted. I want to be clear about what the captain meant, because it is relevant to what followed. She did not mean handler skills. She did not mean behavioral expertise. She meant that I was the person aboard the Reach who was most practiced at keeping living things fed and functional on a regular schedule. She was not wrong. She just was not right in quite the way she thought she was. I went down to Bay 7 the first time, 2 days after we left the waypoint. I went because I had been thinking about it, and I could not leave it alone. The ship's medic, Hoya Taran, had set up a portable triage frame with 3 monitoring leads, and the readings were being relayed to a display unit outside Bay 7. Hoya's idea, so she could check the vitals without entering the hold. I stood at that display for a while before I went in. 3 biosignatures, all alive. The smallest one's readings were worse than the others in several respects that Hoya had annotated in her standard way, which was thorough and precise and difficult to read without a medical qualification, but the overall shape of the numbers did not require a medical qualification to understand. The cubs were in the back corner of the cleared space against the aft bulkhead. The barrier netting was intact. The emergency protein ration packs that the survey team had left the kind we carry for human survival scenarios, which are edible by most warm-blooded species in an emergency, were piled near the barrier, apparently untouched. Not one of the packs had been opened. I stood at the barrier for a while without going through it. They were not doing anything. Soravel cubs at that age are roughly the size of a large domestic cat, maybe 30 kilograms on the larger 2, and something south of 20 on the small one. Though the species index had warned me, the size estimates for young animals were approximations derived from limited survey contact data, which I filed away as something to keep in mind. Copper-colored, all three of them, with black facial markings that looked like a mask over the nose and eyes. Their ears were flat. They were pressed together in the corner, and they were not looking at me. Not because they hadn't noticed me, because they had noticed me and were declining to acknowledge it, which is a different thing, and which I recognized, having spent 11 years feeding people who were in various states of not wanting to be where they were. I had brought a bowl of the protein ration mashed with warm water and a small amount of the rendered fat from the previous night's galley work, because Hoya had told me the emergency ration packs would be low in the kind of caloric density a nursing-age animal would need, and because the fat was surplus and would otherwise go into the waste processor. It was not complicated reasoning. I put the bowl through the gap at the bottom of the cargo netting and set it on the deck plate inside. Then I went away. In the morning, the bowl was empty. I noted this. I took the bowl back, washed it, and thought about it. Then, at 1200, I came back and put another bowl through, this time with slightly more rendered fat and a pinch of the salt mineral supplement from the galley stores, because I had looked up Soravel dietary requirements in the Compacts Species Index in the previous night. The Species Index entry was 14 pages and written for a research audience, so I read the sections I understood and made notes and messaged Hola about the sections I didn't. She had replied by 0200 with annotations. She was a thorough person. The mineral profile, she confirmed, was not dramatically different from some of the other large warm-blooded predators recorded in the outer corindal survey zones. Not the same, but in the right family. I did this 3 times a day. Yola came with me once in the second week, not into Bay 7, but to the display outside. She watched the biosignature feed and made notes in her log. She said the smallest one, the one I was thinking of as Cell by then, was showing early indicators of improvement in the glucose readings, which were the readings that had concerned her most. She said it in the careful way that medical people say things that they are not yet prepared to call good news. I said that was encouraging. She looked at me and said, "You're coming down here 3 times a day." Not a question. More an observation made by someone who was noting a data point and wanted to see if I was aware of it. I said, "That's when the meals are." She wrote something in her log and went back upstairs. My 2 galley assistants, Meret Solis and Tev Harrick, were aware of what I was doing and had collectively decided that they wanted no part of it, which I respected entirely. Meret had told me directly, at the end of the first week, that she thought I was going to get hurt and that she was not going to watch it happen. I said I understood. Tev had expressed his position by never once asking about Bay 7, which over weeks of daily contact becomes its own very clear statement. I went down alone, 3 times a day, and added approximately 40 minutes to my schedule without reducing anything else in it, because the galley does not run itself, and I was not going to let it. The crew by the second week knew what I was doing. Ships are not large communities, and information moves through them without effort. What I gathered from the pattern of conversations in the mess hall, not directed at me, mostly, but the kind of conversations people have that they know you can hear, was that opinion was divided. Some of the survey team members thought it was unnecessary risk for an animal welfare issue that was not properly our responsibility. Some of the crew thought it was admirable in a way that they expressed by not talking about it directly, which I appreciated. The Reach's navigator, a man named Osrath Venn, who had been on board for 7 years, and who I considered a reasonably calibrated judge of situations, said to me one morning over the 0700 service, "How are they eating?" I said, "Better." He nodded. Then he said, "Good. and went back to his coffee. That was the last time he mentioned it. I took it as the support it was. By the end of the second week, Noor, the larger of the two healthy cubs, the one with the widest black facial marking, which ran from the bridge of his nose up and over both eyes, and gave him an expression of permanent, mild skepticism, was sitting approximately 2 meters from the barrier when I arrived. Not at the barrier, 2 meters back, sitting up, not pressed down, watching the gap, watching me come through the whole door and walk to the barrier, not approaching, just watching. I noted this also. I put the bowls through the gap, went away. I should explain something about the timing, because the board will have seen the Hoya Terran testimony already and will know this, but I want to give my version of it as well. I was not using the meal times to habituate the animals to human presence in any calculated way. I was feeding them at 0700, 1200, and 1800 because those were the meal times aboard the Reach. The meal bell rings at those hours. I had a galley to run. The cups were, in practical terms, 3 additional diners on a slightly modified menu, and I fitted them into the schedule the same way I would fit in a survey team member with a restricted diet by adjusting the content, but not the timing. The timing was fixed. It was always fixed. It was fixed before they arrived, and it did not change because of them, and it did not change around them. It was simply the schedule. I think that matters, though I did not understand at the time that it mattered. At the end of the 3rd week, we reached the waypoint. Wildlife provisions confirmed, again, that no handler transfer was available. Captain Tove added this confirmation to what I understood was a growing file, and said nothing to me about it directly. The ship transited onward. Week 5. Veth, the second cub, the one with slightly rounder ears and a tendency to sit at a slight angle, which I had begun to understand was a consequence of one of his lacerations having affected the shoulder joint, and which Hoya had been monitoring with some attention, was at the barrier when I arrived for the 1200 feeding. Not aggressively. He was sitting facing the gap, and when I crouched down to slide the bowl through, he watched the bowl rather than my hand. There was a specificity to the watching that I noticed. He was not tracking movement for threat assessment. He was tracking the bowl because the bowl was what he was there for. I did not read anything into this at the time. I put the bowls through and went away. I should say something about the walk down to Bay 7, because it is part of what Director Morvath's filing characterizes as repeated unsanctioned contact with non-standard fauna in an uncontrolled environment. And I want the board to understand what the walk was actually like. It was a walk from the galley on the upper crew deck, down 2 companionway ladders, through the lower cargo access passage, and to the Bay 7 door. 3 minutes, approximately, carrying bowls. The lighting in the lower cargo passage is functional rather than comfortable, the kind of overhead panels that illuminate work rather than living. The ship makes a particular set of sounds down there that it does not make on the crew deck. The low operational rhythm of the drive units, the occasional settle of stored material in the other bays, the ventilation cycling. It is a quiet part of the ship. I had made that walk 6 times a day for 5 weeks before week 5, and I had never found it remarkable. What changed in week 5 is that I started listening to the ventilation hum differently. Not because I had a reason to. Because I had started to notice that Bay 7, when I opened the door, had a particular quality of attention in it that was different from an empty cargo bay, and I had begun to register that quality as something I was already hearing in the ventilation system, slightly, if I was paying attention during the walk. The hum was different when they were awake and oriented toward the door than when they were resting. I do not have a technical account of why this was. I just noticed it. I mention it only because it is relevant to what came later. Week 6. Cell, who was eating consistently now, and whose biosignature readings Jola had graduated, quietly and without fanfare, from the worried annotations to the standard monitoring column, made her way to the front of the clear space for the first time during a feeding. She did not come to the barrier. She stopped about a meter back and sat. She was watching the bowl, same as Veth. Noor had moved from 2 meters to 1.5. Their positions were not random. I noticed, for the first time in week 6, that their positions were consistent. Veth at the gap, Noor to the left and back, Sal to the right and back. The same positions. Every feeding. The consistency was not something I had created intentionally. I had not moved the bowls to different spots as a training measure or varied my approach to see what they did. I had put the bowls through the gap in the same place every time, because that was where the gap was, and they had arranged themselves relative to the gap in a pattern that suited them, and the pattern had held. I was the fixed point. They had organized around me. This is the thing that I think the board should understand about what happened over those 12 weeks. I was not shaping them. The schedule was the fixed point. I was just the one who kept the schedule. I began, at this point, making small modifications to the ration mix, not dramatic ones. The species index noted that Soravel, at this developmental stage, have sensory preferences for aromatic compounds in the mild aldehyde range. Jola translated this as meaning they respond well to things that have been cooked, specifically to the kind of smell that comes off browned proteins in a working kitchen. My galley was producing this smell 3 times a day. It had apparently been permeating down through the ventilation to Bay 7 for 6 weeks. This was, Hoya said, part of the orientation pattern they had been learning. The schedule not just from the bowl deliveries, but from the smell that preceded them, which meant that by week 6, they were able to track the approximate timing without me present. I started bringing the bowls warm, straight from the galley, rather than cooling during the walk down. It added perhaps 3 minutes to the delivery if I moved quickly. I moved quickly. Week 7 brought a change I had not anticipated. Noor, at the 1800 feeding, did something that I registered clearly enough to note in my daily log, which I was keeping at Jola's suggestion as a welfare record. He moved to 1 meter from the barrier, not at the feeding, after the feeding. I had put the bowls through and was straightening up to leave when he moved forward past his usual position and sat at 1 meter from the netting and looked at me. Just looked. No vocalization. No posturing. Just looked. I stood there for a moment. Then I said, "Good evening," which I recognize is not a thing one says to a Soravel cub, but it was the thing I said, and he watched me say it. And then I went upstairs to close the kitchen for the night. I noted it in the log, as Noor approached to 1 meter at end of 18, feeding no aggression appeared evaluative. Jola read the log, as she read all the logs, and messaged me. Evaluative is the right word. They're learning your pattern. I replied that I supposed they were. She replied, "That's not a welfare problem, just so you know." Week 8. Veth met me at the barrier. I want to be precise about what I mean by this. I came to the 1200 feeding, and when I reached Bay 7, the barrier was where it always was, and the cargo netting was intact. But Veth was sitting on the other side of the netting, directly opposite the gap, with his nose approximately 3 centimeters from the mesh. He had moved from his usual position to the gap before I arrived. He had, in other words, anticipated the timing. When I crouched down to slide the bowl through the gap, he did not move back. He watched the bowl clear the gap, and then he looked up at me, and I looked at him. His eyes are amber. That is true of all three of them. The species index confirms amber as the standard Soravel eye coloration, but Veth's are a particular quality of amber, clear in a way that catches light well. Looking into them at 3 centimeters of distance through cargo netting, I was struck by the experience in a way I did not try to analyze immediately. I noted it. I stood up and went away, because I had a galley to run and a 1200 meal service to finish, and the crew ate on schedule. He was at the barrier, at the 1800 feeding as well, and at 0700 the following morning. By week 10, all 3 of them were at the barrier at feeding times. Veth consistently at the gap, nose near the netting, watching the bowl come through. Noor 2 meters back and to the left, sitting at that slight angle he favored. Sel at the barrier to the right of the gap, which had become her position. She was larger by then, not dramatically, but visibly. All 3 of them were larger. 30 kilograms had become 40-45 in Veth's case, and it was becoming apparent to me, looking at them each day, that the compact species index estimates for Soravel developmental velocity were indeed conservative. I updated my notes. I should note something about my 2 assistants at this point, because it is relevant to what Director Morvath's filing calls the crew complicity element of his documentation, which I think is an inaccurate characterization, but which I want to address. Marit and Tev had not changed their position on Bay 7. They still wanted nothing to do with it, but they had both, independently and without being asked, begun timing the warm ration preparation to coincide with my departure downstairs. Which is to say, by week 9, when I picked up the bowls to take them down, they were always warm, because whoever was working the prep station had been managing the warming timing without me asking. I did not comment on this. Neither did they. It was simply part of the 1200 and 1800 preparation rhythm, the same as any other item on the service roster. Captain Tove came down to Bay 7 at week 10. I was there for the 1800 feeding when she arrived. She stood behind me for a while without saying anything. Veth watched her. Noor watched her from his left side position, with that permanent, mild skepticism the wide facial marking gave him. Sel adjusted her position not aggressively, but the adjustment was deliberate. A shift from her usual right barrier seat to a position slightly more angled, and I understood, watching it happen, that she was repositioning relative to the captain in a way that was different from how she positioned relative to me. "They're bigger," the captain said. "Yes," I said, "significantly bigger." The species index was conservative. She watched Veth watching her. "How are they eating?" "Well," I said, "all 3. She nodded slowly. There was a silence that lasted long enough for Noor to look between the captain and the empty bowls and then back at me, in a way that I was beginning to be able to read as a specific kind of Soravel comment. I did not relay this observation to the captain. She said, "Ross, I have had a second communication from Wildlife Provisions at Hellick. They are sending an extraction team to meet us at Hellick instead of waiting for landfall. The team will have a handler and compliance equipment." I said I understood. She said, "I thought you should know before we arrive." I said I appreciated that. She stood there another moment. Veth was still watching her, not moving, not making any sound, just watching with those amber eyes in the particular way I had come to understand as his assessment mode, not threat evaluation, not prey tracking, something more like cataloging, like filing. "They're going to be difficult to move," she said. It was not really a question. I don't know, I said honestly. I haven't tried. She left. I went back upstairs and cleaned the galley and set up the 0700 prep for the following morning. And I noted in the log that the captain had visited and that the animals had behaved within their established pattern, which was accurate as far as it went. The compact wildlife provisions extraction team boarded at Waystation Halleck on the second day of the layover. The team was 4 people. A senior handler named Calla Dresden, with, I was told, 12 years of fauna management experience, 2 junior handlers whose names I did not catch at introduction, and their director, Sile Morvath, who held a compact wildlife provisions operational director designation, and who was, in the manner of his introduction, quite clear that he was the person responsible for resolving what he called the extended, unmanaged transit situation that had developed aboard the Reach. Director Morvath spoke to me briefly on the second day of the layover in the cargo supervisor's office 1 level above Bay 7. He was a compact man, not particularly tall, with a kind of precision in his clothing and his speech that suggested he was accustomed to managing things well and expected that precision to translate. He said he had reviewed my daily contact logs and the biosignature data from Hoya's monitoring unit, and that he was pleased the animals had been maintained in acceptable condition given the circumstances, a phrase he used twice, which gave me the impression that, given the circumstances, was carrying quite a bit of weight in his assessment of the situation. He asked if I had any concerns about the extraction procedure. I said I did not have any expertise in extraction procedures. He said the team would handle it. He said it with the confidence of a person who has handled 12 years of fauna management situations and finds the current one unusual but not outside his established frame of reference. I nodded and went back to the galley. They went down to Bay 7 on the 3rd day. I was in the galley for the mid-morning prep when it happened. Between the 0700 service cleanup and the 1200 prep is a 2-hour window that I use for inventory, for menu planning for the next transit leg, and for the minor equipment maintenance that accumulates during a long circuit. Marette was with me, working through the cold store inventory. Tav was running the dishwasher through its mid-morning cycle and keeping one eye on it because it had been making a noise lately that suggested the bearing on the lower drum was approaching the end of its service life. At 11:40, which is 20 minutes before the meal bell, I heard something from below. Not a crash. Not the kind of sound that an alarm or a collision produces. Something more like a sequence of layered vocalizations, building and then holding, that I identified having heard elements of them in various configurations across 10 weeks of daily contact as Soravel vocalizations. Specifically, as the combination that Veth produced when something in his environment had departed significantly from his established expectations, joined by the lower resonance that Noor contributed when he agreed with Veth's assessment. It was considerably louder than I was used to hearing it through 2 decks of plating. Marette looked at me. I looked at the ceiling, which was the deck above us, which was the deck above Bay 7. At 11:52, my comm unit signaled, Captain Tov. She said, Ross, Bay 7. I said, Yes, Captain. She said, Now. I put down the inventory report. I picked up the meal bell, the handheld one I use for the 0700 service announcement on the crew deck, a small brass instrument about the size of my fist that I have carried for 11 years. It lives in my jacket pocket. I took it out. I also picked up the ladle from the prep counter, for no reason I could articulate at the time. Then I went downstairs. The situation in Bay 7 was as follows. The cargo netting barrier was on the floor, off to one side, not collapsed, carefully placed, as though someone had moved it out of the way of whatever they were planning to do. The 4 members of the extraction team were in the far left corner of the cleared space against the corner wall in a configuration that I recognized. From years of watching people in spaces where something unexpected was happening, as the configuration of people who have stopped moving because moving has recently produced results they did not want. They were not injured. They were very still. Kala Dresden, the senior handler, had a compliance rod in her right hand, the kind that delivers a targeted sensory disruption pulse calibrated for large fauna, and it was not deployed. The arm holding it was at her side, in the posture of a professional who has assessed a situation and concluded that deployment would not improve it. I respected that conclusion. Veth was in the center of the cleared space. He was standing. He was not making any sound, which I knew, by 10 weeks of daily observation, to mean something different from when he was quiet under ordinary circumstances. When Veth was comfortable, his quiet was soft and settled. This quiet was not soft. It was the quiet of something that has reached a conclusion and is waiting for the surrounding environment to catch up with it. Noor was to the left, positioned between the extraction team's corner and the nearest route to the former barrier gap. Sel was behind me. I register this as I enter the hold, the small sound of her adjusting her position on the deck plate to my right and slightly behind, a position she had been taking up with increasing consistency over the preceding 3 weeks when I came into Bay 7. I had stopped noting it internally as unusual. I looked at the extraction team in their corner. I looked at Veth in the center of the hold. I looked at the meal bell in my hand. I rang it 3 times. That is the standard pattern. 3 rings for the 1200 service. It was 11:56 by then, a few minutes early, but close enough to the schedule that I was not concerned about disrupting the rhythm. What happened next is what I described in my incident log, and what I will describe to the board now, and I would ask that the board consider it as straightforwardly as I can present it. Veth turned around. He turned away from the extraction team's corner, toward me, and walked across the cleared space at the same pace he used for every other approach to the feeding position, not hurrying, not performing anything for the benefit of anyone watching, walking the way he always walked when the bell had rung, which was with the certainty of an animal that knows what the bell means and has no ambiguity about what comes next. Noor moved from his position at the left. Sel adjusted behind me, coming forward to the right side. They arranged themselves in the feeding configuration. Veth at the front where the gap had been, Noor to the left, Sel to the right, and they looked at me, waiting. I was holding the ladle. I did not have the bowls. The bowls were upstairs in the galley because I had not had time to fill them before coming down. I looked at Veth. Veth looked at the ladle. Then he looked at me. The expression was not accusatory. It was, if anything, patient. But it was patient in the way that something patient gets when it has decided to wait for you to sort yourself out. I said, to nobody in particular, I need to get the bowls. I went back upstairs. I filled the bowls. I came back down. I set them out on the deck plate in the feeding positions front, left, right, and the 3 of them ate. The extraction team filed out of Bay 7 while this was happening. I did not watch them go. I was watching the bowls, because one of the things I had learned over 10 weeks was that you watch the bowls until they are done and you pick them up clean, because leaving a bowl in the space creates a different kind of expectation, and I was not there to create unexpected expectations. Director Morvath spoke to me at length that evening, in the cargo supervisor's office. He was very precise. He wanted me to understand that the animals were required to be transferred to a wildlife provisions holding facility at Hellick, and that my role aboard the Reach did not include any formal authority over that process, and that the compact's operational protocols were clear on the matter. I said I understood all of that. He said the extraction team would attempt the transfer again the following morning with modified compliance protocols. He asked if I had any input. I thought about it for a moment. Then I said, "Ring the bell first, then walk them." He looked at me for a moment with the expression of a professional who has just received practical advice from a person he does not consider a relevant authority. Then he said, "You're saying the bell functions as a compliance trigger." I said, "I'm saying they know what the bell means. If you ring it and then walk in the direction you want them to go, I think they'll follow." He said, "That's not how compliance transfers work." I said, "No, but it's how they work." He was quiet for a while. He wrote something in his documentation. Then he said he would note my input. The transfer the following morning did not involve compliance rods or relocation equipment of any kind. Wildlife Provisions, to Director Morvath's credit, made a practical decision. It involved me walking from the Reach's cargo ramp across the Halleck dock to the Wildlife Provisions intake bay, approximately 340 meters, along a service route that the dock supervisor had agreed to clear in advance. I rang the bell once at the top of the ramp to signal the 1200 service. I walked. I did not look back. The dock was busy. Halleck is a Class II way station, which means there were cargo loaders operating, crew personnel from 3 other vessels present on the lower dock, a compact administrative inspection team working through manifests near the South Bay, and the ordinary ambient noise and machinery of a working transit hub. None of that was unusual. What was apparently unusual, according to the after-action notes filed by the dock supervisor, which I have also read, at the board's request, was that a ship's cook in a galley apron was walking across a working dock with 3 very large copper-furred animals following him in a loose formation. Veth 2 steps behind and to my left, Noor behind Veth and slightly wider, Sel behind me and to the right, in what I recognized as her established position. The dock supervisor noted that dock traffic, which he described as normally self-managing, had arranged itself into a corridor without specific instruction. I did not notice this at the time because I was focused on not walking into anything as the dock was busy, and I was carrying a ladle, which is not ideal for visibility at head height. I delivered them to the Wildlife Provisions intake bay. I handed over Hola's biosignature records and my 12 weeks of daily feeding logs. The intake officer looked at the logs, and then at the 3 animals, and then at me with the particular expression of a person who is computing something significant and has not yet finished. She said, "Are you their registered keeper?" I said, "No, I'm their cook." She wrote something down. I went back to the Reach. Now, the inquiry board will be aware that the Wildlife Provisions Behavioral Assessment at Halleck produced several findings that are relevant to the designation that has subsequently been applied to the feeding schedule. I want to address these in the order they appear in the assessment documentation, because Director Morvath's filing has characterized them in a way that I believe overstates the degree of calculation involved in what I did, and I would like to offer a different account. The behavioral assessment team at Halleck ran the standard intake protocol for Soravel subadults, a protocol that involves, among other things, feeding trials using standard Soravel dietary formulations and a controlled behavioral response mapping exercise designed to establish baseline behavioral parameters for placement purposes. What the assessment found across the first 4 days was that the three animals declined standard provision entirely, not with aggression, with the quiet patience of animals that are waiting for something they are confident will eventually arrive. On the fifth day, the intake team introduced warm protein provision with an aldehyde aromatic compound profile, something that Hoya and I had been producing for 10 weeks in the Reach's galley. Intake resumed immediately for all three animals. On the seventh day, an assessment handler rang a bell in the facility corridor during a preparation exercise for a different protocol test, and the behavioral response was documented in the assessment as significant, consistent, and reproducible. All three animals oriented toward the bell source and moved toward it in their feeding configuration. Veth forward, nor left. Cell right, without any other signal or cue. The assessment team documented this across multiple trials over the following 5 days. They brought the documentation to Wildlife Provision's regulatory oversight. Regulatory oversight determined that under Article 19 of the Compact Wildlife Provisions Charter, which governs anchor individual feeding covenant designations for non-standard fauna demonstrating established nutritional dependency on a specific provisioning schedule, the documented behavioral response pattern met the formal designation threshold. The designation is First Bell Protocol. I did not choose that name. The assessment team named it based on the feeding trigger documentation in my logs, where I had noted the feeding times as aligned with the ship's meal bell schedule. The bell is in the logs because I mentioned the bell in the logs because the bell was part of the schedule and the schedule was the basis for the feeding pattern, and I was documenting the feeding pattern as a welfare record. This chain of documentation is apparently sufficient basis for a formal Article 19 designation, which I note without complaint, but also without having intended it. What the designation means in practical terms: the three Soravel have a compact registered nutritional and behavioral dependency on a specific provisioning schedule associated with a specific anchor individual, which is me. And this dependency has been formally recognized as a territorial anchor covenant under compact wildlife law. Director Morvath's filing argues that this designation is the result of an unauthorized and irresponsible habituation program conducted without compact approval or handler credentials, and that I am therefore liable for the administrative complications that have followed. I want to address this directly. I rang the bell at 700, 1200, and 1800 because those are the meal times. I brought warm food because warm food has better caloric density for animals in nutritional recovery, and because I had the galley and the surplus and the schedule. I went back every day because I had 3 additional diners who were not eating anything, and then they were eating something. And once something is eating on your schedule, you do not simply stop showing up. That is not how a galley operates. You show up, you ring the bell, you put the food through, you go away and come back in 6 hours and do it again. I did not conduct a habituation program. I ran a galley. The situation that has produced this inquiry and Director Morvath's filing, and what I understand to be a considerable amount of documentation at the Wildlife Provisions Regional Office, is this. The 3 Soravel have been at the Halleck Holding Facility for 4 months. The standard placement assessment has not been completable in that time. The animals eat. They are healthy. They are growing. But the standard placement procedure assumes a behavioral baseline that does not include a First Bell Protocol designation, and the animals are not producing that baseline because they are producing a different one. They are waiting, not anxiously, not with distress. The facility behavioral staff, in the documentation I have been provided, consistently describe the animals as calm, cooperative, and in robust health. They simply do not engage with the standard placement assessment protocol in the manner the protocol expects. They engage with bell-timed warm food delivery. They engage with the specific positional configuration they have held since week 6 of the reach transit. They engage, the documentation suggests, with the expectation of consistency, the expectation that the world will do what it has always done at the times it has always done it. In plain terms, they are waiting for the bell, and the bell is 11 transit weeks away aboard the Korath's reach. Director Morvath's characterization is that this is my fault. I understand his position. He is managing a facility situation that does not map to his established protocols, caused by a 12-week period of informal animal welfare management by an unqualified galley cook. From an administrative standpoint, I am the problem. I want to say, with respect for the board and for Director Morvath's considerable experience, that I think the characterization is missing something. The Soravel developmental record in the assessment documentation notes the following weights at intake assessment. Veth, 93 kilograms. Noor, 87 kilograms. Cell, 78 kilograms. Those were the week 12 numbers. The board will have the most current assessment data as well, and I have been provided copies. Current weights. Veth, 208 kilograms. Noor, 194 kilograms. Cell, 181 kilograms. They are no longer the size of large domestic cats. The facility staff describes them as cooperative but immovable, which I find to be an accurate description of what happens when something the size of a small loaded cargo transport decides it is comfortable where it is, and sees no compelling reason to change that. The extraction team that came aboard the Reach at Halleck found this out in Bay 7. The facility has been finding it out for 4 months. A wildlife provisions placement specialist named Cora Veth, no relation to the animal, it is a common name in the outer corridor, visited the facility 2 weeks ago. Her assessment report contains an observation I will read to the board because I want to be precise. The animals display no aggression and no territorial behavior in response to facility, staff, or visitor presence. They display no behavioral dysfunction. They are eating, growing, and presenting all observable developmental milestones within normal Soravel parameters. The Article 19 designation appears to have produced a nutritional and relational dependency that is stable, healthy, and based on current behavioral evidence, likely permanent. The placement difficulty is not a welfare problem. It is a logistics problem. Specifically, it is the problem of a bell. Director Morvath's response to this assessment was the filing that brought me to this room. I accept that. I am here. I want to tell the board one more thing, which is not in any of the documentation because it happened 3 weeks ago and I did not file a report on it. I was at Way Station Halleck on a 2-day layover while the Reach took on stores. I had some free hours in the afternoon of the first day. I walked over to the Wildlife Provisions facility, which is 20 minutes from the main dock on foot. I told the gate officer who I was. She let me in without contacting Director Morvath's office, which I noticed and about which I am making no comment. She showed me to the South Bay. I had the meal bell in my jacket pocket. It is always in my jacket pocket. I did not make a specific decision to bring it. It was there because it is always there. Cell heard me before I reached the South Bay door. I know this because I heard, through the door, a sound I had not heard in 4 months, the low chest resonance she produces when something she recognizes is near. Not distressed. a recognition sound. By the time I had my hand on the door handle, Veth had joined it, the slightly higher tone he uses. And by the time I opened the door, all three were at the near end of the habitat space with their attention on the door. At 208 kilograms, Veth is a different scale of animal than the one I put bowls through cargo netting for 12 weeks ago. I want to be accurate about this because I think it matters to the board's understanding of the situation. The habitat space in the South Bay is large. It is designed for animals of their classification, which is to say, it is designed for animals that can do significant damage if they choose to, and which are not choosing to. The three of them filled the near end of it in a way that the space did not feel empty anywhere I looked. I stood in the doorway for a moment. I was not afraid, which I note not to impress the board, but because I think the board may have a question about it, and I want to answer it before it is asked. I was not afraid because I knew them. I had watched Veth watch me through cargo netting. I had seen Cell move from the back corner of a cargo hold to the right side of a feeding position over the course of 3 months. I had watched Noor's permanent, mild skepticism resolve, at some point in week 9, into something that I did not have a word for but that I recognized, having watched people in galley seats for 11 years. As comfort. I was not afraid. I was, if I am being precise about it, glad to see them. I rang the bell 3 times, the 1200 pattern. They came to their positions. Left, center, right, Noor at the left, Veth at the front, Cell at the right. 194 kilograms, 208 kilograms, 181 kilograms of Soravel, arranged on the floor of the South Bay in the same configuration as 3 cubs pushing their noses through cargo netting toward a galley bowl, waiting. I was holding the ladle. I did not have bowls. I had not thought to bring bowls. I had not thought 3 weeks ago on a 2-day helic layover that I would be standing in the Wildlife Provisions South Bay needing bowls. I stood there with a ladle in one hand and a bell in the other, and I looked at Veth, and Veth looked at me with those amber eyes. I said, "I'm working on it." Veth lowered his head and put his chin on my shoulder. I want to describe this accurately. He had to lower his head by some distance to do this. I am not a tall man, and he is a large animal. But he lowered it slowly and set his chin on my shoulder and held it there, the weight of it settling in the way that large warm things settle when they're choosing to be still. Cell leaned from the right, not abruptly, just the gradual press of something substantial finding its angle. Noor remained in his position to the left, watching the space around us in what I had learned over 12 weeks of daily observation was his characteristic mode when the group was settled and Veth had made a decision about a situation watchful, not because there was a threat, but because watching was his contribution to the arrangement. I stood there for a while. I did not have bowls. I had nothing useful to offer them except the fact of being there, which, it occurred to me standing in that South Bay, was perhaps the thing I had always been offering them. I stayed for 40 minutes. Then I had to get back to the Reach for the 1800 service. I rang the bell once when I left. One ring, which is the signal I use at the end of the last feeding of the day to indicate the galley is closed, a habit I had apparently been consistent about for 12 weeks, and which they had learned alongside all the other elements of the closed. Schedule. Veth lifted his head from my shoulder when I rang it. He did not follow me to the door. He sat where he was and watched me go in the way that I had come to understand over a long time of watching them, as the Soravel version of seeing someone off. I walked back to the dock. I had the ladle in my hand and the bell in my pocket, and I did not have anything in particular to say about it. The board will need to determine what Director Morvath's filing constitutes and what the appropriate response to it is. I have been told by the regional officer Credential that one outcome under consideration is a formal designation of me as an Article 19 anchor individual with associated compact wildlife provisions obligations, which would mean, in practical terms, that the compact has a legal interest in my availability that is linked to the well-being of 3 specific Soravel, and that any change to my employment situation would need to be cleared through wildlife provisions before it could be finalized. I am not sure how I feel about this. I am a cook. I have a Grade 2 galley certificate and 11 years of service on civilian transport. I have never wanted to be a handler. I do not have handler credentials and have no current intention of acquiring them. But I am the person who rang the bell every day for 12 weeks at the dock in the South Bay 3 weeks ago, and I will ring it again every time the Reach makes a helic layover because it is in my pocket and that is what it is for. If the board decides that constitutes a formal Article 19 anchor designation, then that is the board's determination to make, and I will accept it. I would only ask that they note, for the record, that I am not a handler. Director Morvath's filing argues that the situation is my fault. I understand his position. He arrived at Bay 7 with 12 years of experience and a compliance team and 4 people trained in standard fauna management procedure and 3 animals that had been in a cargo hold for 10 weeks. And they sat down in their positions and waited for a cook. That is not, I think, a failure of the compliance procedure. The procedure is designed for animals responding to external control structures. Veth, Noor, and Cell were not responding to an external control structure. They were responding to a schedule, to the certainty that at 0700 and 1200 and 1800 every day, the bell would ring, that the bell had always rung, that the bell would ring again. I did not build that certainty for them deliberately. I provided the material and showed up and rang the bell every day because that is what I do. The ship moves or it does not move. The stores change. The survey teams rotate. The transit legs end and new ones begin. The bell rings at 0700, 1200, and 1800. They build the rest themselves. Out of 12 weeks of the same thing happening at the same time, every day, without fail. I think, and I recognize that thinking this is not within my expertise, but I think they had not had that before. The burrow, the female that did not come back. And then a cargo hold, an emergency ration packs in a pile near a barrier, untouched, and whatever that means to a 20-kilogram animal that has recently lost the most reliable thing in its world. And then the bell. I just kept ringing it. That is the most I can tell the board. If the inquiry requires any further documentation from my galley logs or from Hoya Terran's biosignature records, I am happy to provide them. If it requires me to attend additional sessions, I will arrange it around the Reach's transit schedule. But if the board would like me to go back to Helic and ring the bell, I can do that without any arrangement at all. I have it right here,